Sylvester, first of all, thank you so much for talking with us at Technically about, just 1 Philadelphia and a lot of other great things that are happening for you right now. We really appreciate you taking this time.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for starters, what is 1 Philadelphia and how did the initiative come about originally? I know you guys have been cooking before Dr. J tweeted about you. So can you talk a little bit about the background of 1 Philadelphia?
Yeah, One Philadelphia is really an initiative that's designed to bring together partners across spaces, across sectors. So how do we bring business, education, nonprofit, government? How do we bring everyone together and really get people to rally behind a bigger vision?
Mm,
Often when we talk about underrepresented people, especially Black and brown people, it's in the context of how many Black people can we push into jobs as quickly as possible. We're not often thinking about how do we create as much opportunity as possible. It's, how do we just create a workforce as quickly as we can.
mm,
And 1 Philadelphia is really, if we took a step back and all worked together around a bigger vision for more opportunity for underrepresented young people, or underrepresented people in general, how do we do
mhm,
that? And what does that look like? And, it came about because a lot of the work of 1 Philadelphia, Coded by Kids was already doing.
mm.
We often talk about problems without looking at the systemic drivers of those problems, without looking
Right.
at the roots of those problems. And, over the last 7, 8 years, we've been working to address issues of underrepresentation in the tech and innovation space. But as we're trying to address those issues, we're constantly running up against systemic issues that are driving inequity. So we have to also address those. And we were doing all of this work around the more systemic issues just in an ad hoc way as an organization to facilitate our work. And 1 Philadelphia was really us saying, what does it look like if we do this officially? If we make this an actual thing, make this an actual initiative, and use this to do the facilitation, to build the infrastructure, to address the more systemic issues that we need to do the work that we need to do to make our work successful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And making that work more successful, what type of activity is the initiative currently involved in? Like, what are some plans that you guys have?
So a lot of the early work has been around outreach and awareness. The
Hmm.
reason we focus a lot of the early work on outreach and awareness is we found that there's a ton of opportunity in the tech and startup space. But
Hmm.
when you talk to people in underrepresented communities, they don't understand what the opportunity is. They don't understand how they can get engaged. They don't understand how it could benefit them. So, if we want people to take advantage of these opportunities, we have to start with really getting them to a point where they have enough of a context to
Hmm.
understand it. They understand how they can get engaged. They understand how it can benefit them. They understand where they fit in.
Right.
So a lot of the early work has been around that, and then bringing together partners and really thinking through and looking at what are the highest impact partnerships that we can put together to move things in the right direction. So as an
Hmm.
example, we're currently working on a software development apprenticeship and a software development pre-apprenticeship so that we're able to move people into software development roles who may not be looking at college as their next step. But
Mm.
then on the other end of that, we're working to build out a venture studio
Mhm.
within the under that larger umbrella where we're helping underrepresented startup founders and potential founders pull the pieces together that they need to build scalable high growth startups.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I appreciate you adding that context because I mean, you are the brain behind Coded by Kids, and you have a personal investment in seeing, kids, particularly, kids of color, find success within tech. So with that, I wanted to ask you, about the, recently launched Innovation League. It's aimed at entrepreneurial and creative youth engagement. So how does that support One Philadelphia's mission, and what are its growth plans?
It's all about awareness.
Mm,
The Innovation League was, our need finding, us looking for ways, how do we find more ways of getting people to engage with a space that
right,
they wouldn't normally engage in. And the Innovation League was one of those ideas, like, hey, maybe this is a way where it's a low barrier to entry for parents and young people that will start exposing them to the space. And then
right.
from that exposure, we can introduce them to other things.
Absolutely, absolutely. What are your plan? What are One Philadelphia, excuse me, plans for the rest of the this year and next year?
So a part of it is looking at what worked, what didn't work last year,
Mhm.
rolling that in. Some of the, to be honest, some of the challenges that we had were, we're trying to roll out in-person programming during COVID,
Right,
which, that's never an easy undertaking. Um, at the same time, one of the things I didn't account for, we had parents coming to us saying, with the increase in gun violence and the increase in violent crime in the city, we don't feel comfortable with our kids coming to this by themselves and then coming home, after dark, on their own, which wasn't
mm,
something we accounted for, but it ended up becoming a real thing
right.
for a large number of parents. So right now we're trying to really figure out how do we adjust
Mm.
for those things. And there's some things we can do to adjust to roll into the next iteration. The other part of that reality is there are some things that we can't do. Um, we definitely need support and help in terms of it. And so here we're going full circle. We go back to systemic issues.
Right.
The issues around crime and do parents feel comfortable or safe sending their kids, those are more systemic drivers of the outcomes of our program. And that's where the support from elected officials and the larger work throughout the city around those things really comes in.
Indeed, indeed. And I think that's very important to consider because one of the sobering things about the work that you do with Coded by Kids is that, if it's happening in Philadelphia, it's not incubated, not by any stretch of the imagination. So gun violence is at a very morbid level in the city right now, and that directly affects a lot of the kids who focus on your guys' program. So it's very important heads up for you to be aware that as these parents are talking about the well-being of their children. So that's super important. Uh, what are the initiatives, like tangible outcomes, like that you guys hope to achieve in who knows 5, maybe even 10 years? Like, what are some ways in which you guys are hoping to move the needle?
Yeah, if you look at a lot of the work that we're doing, a lot of the work isn't programmatic. It's always, people love talking about programs and like, are you going to do this exciting thing? A lot of the work isn't exciting or sexy. A lot of the work is infrastructure that we need to facilitate an effective, equitable innovation ecosystem in the city. And when we think about outcomes 5 and 10 years from now, a lot of it is tied to that. What we look at is we want to be able to point our finger and draw a line from increases in participation in the tech space. Do we have more underrepresented people participating at all levels, not just at the lower levels, which is often what happens. One of the first things I saw when I got into tech 20 years ago was you get a concentration of diversity in the lowest paying jobs in tech with the least opportunity for growth. As you move up the ladder, there's almost no diversity. Your diversity is
Mm,
out dramatically. So we want to see increases in participation with underrepresented people at all levels, especially those levels that have significant opportunity for growth. The other part of it is, can we point to increases in participation and success in the startup space with underrepresented founders.
Mhm.
You know, a lot of times when we talk about underrepresented people, especially Black and brown people, and we talk about entrepreneurship, it's in the context of small business. We usually don't talk about Black and brown people in the context of starting scalable, high growth startups.
Mm.
So for us, there is a hyper focus on that. And we want to be able to point to, hey, we have, an increase in underrepresented founders in the city of Philadelphia that aren't just getting into the startup space, but they're raising capital and they're finding success in the startup space because of this infrastructure and the systems we've built.
I think that's a very, very valuable thing to point out because I agree with you 100% from my reporting. It is too often when we look at those Black and brown founders, for all intents and purposes, they are founders as, just small business owners. We don't even a lot of times even allow them to have the credit of, being the founder of something that is a scalable business in a way in which we would look at, just startup founders from other, backgrounds. And so I appreciate you at pointing that out. With Coded by Kids, 1Philadelphia, and Plain Sight Capital, you're leading several different orgs and initiatives. How do they intersect and support each other?
So if you think about the work of, let's take Coded by Kids as an example. Coded by Kids isn't successful without a thriving and effective innovation ecosystem that it sits on top of. If you go back to, you think back to, my reasoning for starting 1Philadelphia, we saw major gaps in that ecosystem that we needed for Coded by Kids to be successful and for Coded by Kids to thrive. Coded by Kids is really just another organization that's a part of that larger ecosystem of 1Philadelphia. But without that ecosystem, it's hard to see long-term how not just Coded by Kids, but any of the organizations in this space are as successful as they can or need to be for that matter. And then Plain Sight Capital, again, is a part of that ecosystem. If you think about it, a lot of times when we talk about what Philadelphia needs, we talk about things in isolation, or we talk about things in silos. So like Philadelphia needs more venture capital, but you miss all of the other things that Philadelphia needs for it, for this ecosystem to thrive. And then some people will say Philadelphia needs better education, but then you miss all. So it's, for us, it's how do we look at what the ecosystem as a whole needs for it to thrive and be successful? And Plain Sight Capital is the capital aspect of what the ecosystem needs.
Got it. Yeah, and I appreciate you like breaking that down into those terms because it's too often which as a reporter on business and tech in Philly, I hear this all too often. People, especially people from marginalized backgrounds in the business spaces, they will say the same thing. Yeah, such and such offers me this solution as like the thing, right? As the solution. Whereas realistically, there's at least a small grocery list of things that need fixing. But however, the only thing that's getting spoken to is maybe just one grant or just one fund. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
And
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was like, if you think about it, I had a conversation with someone one time, and they said to me, "Well, it seems like you're trying to boil the ocean, and you're trying to do all of these things." And my response was, the ocean has already been boiled. If you look at inequity in our country, it's been ingrained in every aspect of our society. Like inequity isn't siloed. You see it in education, you see it in business, you see it in funding, you see it in capital. So the only way to address that and to unwind it is to have the same systemic approach that was used to create it. You're not going to, address the inequity if you're looking at it like, well, we're just going to do this one thing. We're just going to focus on this one thing, because that's not how the inequity has been ingrained in our society. So I think it's crazy to think that we're actually going to address it, with this narrow focus.
Absolutely. Shifting forward a little bit, One Philadelphia has several high-profile funding partners such as Comcast, PwC, Bank of America, the Lenfest Institute. What do they contribute to the initiative besides funding, and how do you get partners like that on board, like initially?
So the one thing I want to say is, in the nonprofit space,
Mhm.
people always ask the question, what are funders providing besides funding? And
Mhm.
I often push back on that because what organizations tend to need the most in this space is funding.
Right, 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 right.
It's the money to do what they need to do, especially as a Black founder. There is clear data that shows that Black founders struggle with raising money relative to their white counterparts. Black founders don't have the same access to capital and the same supports and resources. So as a Black founder who's trying to lead this work, one of the biggest things that they can do and have, really been amazing partners with is saying, we know you need capital.
Right.
One of my biggest complaints, both in the nonprofit and startup space, is if you look at a lot of the programs for both nonprofit leaders, but also, Black startup leaders, it's education, but there's no capital.
Mm.
So it's like, you come through this program and you're gonna learn how to be a better CEO, you're gonna learn this, but there's no money. And
Mm.
at some point, we're running organizations. Like I
Right.
have to make payroll, we got to build programs. So the education stuff is, it's cool, but I need money, so that we can do the work we need to do. The thing I say a lot is the problems that we're trying to address, the things
Mhm.
that we're trying to solve, these problems were, they were created through intentional disinvestment.
Absolutely, for certain, for certain.
So you can't solve disinvestment with more disinvestment, which is what we're
Mm.
often doing and what we're often trying to do. So, I want to highlight and call out the fact that as funders, they're actually doing what a lot of other funders in their position aren't doing. They're willing to take a chance on something that isn't proven. They're willing to get behind a Black nonprofit leader that's saying, I have this crazy idea for this thing that could work, but I need you to get behind it and fund it. That is not a common thing that you see happening with
Mm.
funders in their position. So, I don't want to minimize just the impact that that has. The other aspect of it is, they've been amazing thought partners.
Mhm.
They're funders who we can sit and have a conversation about what's working, what's not working. How do we improve things? How do we move things in a better direction? They've also been amazing with having very thoughtful and deliberate conversations around how do we
Mm.
pull resources to the table? How do we amplify this? How do we expand this? How do we ensure that you're positioned to scale?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I appreciate you providing that context because I know of your experience, you constantly are engaging these thought leaders. And so you have a very solid understanding of, the machinations of these partnerships. It's yes, the money is important, but also like actually getting the education and, having that kind of rapport is doubly important. So that's super, super special to point out. And then finally, this is kind of a two-pronged question, and then I'll get out your hair. Are there examples of success in this area that you're attempting to emulate with 1Philadelphia? What other organizations and initiatives, inspire you? And then finally, what lessons could you share for other orgs that have similar goals as you?
Um, when I think about other orgs and successes, the unfortunate thing that I think about is if you look at not just the city of Philadelphia, we can look internally and see it, but if you look across, the United States, when you look at outcomes for underrepresented people, especially Black and brown people, our country isn't producing great outcomes. You know, that is the reality. But we have all of these organizations, we have all of this money going to it, but we're not producing great outcomes. And the same way, when I started Coded by Kids, I made a very intentional decision to not use our education system as the model. I actually looked outside of our education system because our education system hasn't done a great job in terms of outcomes with, you know, working with Black and brown kids and preparing them for greater opportunities. So I thought it was crazy to design an education organization off of an education system that has not done a good job of producing positive outcomes. In a lot of ways, the same thing here. You know, a lot of my frustration that drove me to start 1Philadelphia was looking at outcomes that were being produced and saying to people, we're committing and investing a ton of money and resources and time, but we're not actually moving the needle forward. We're not actually creating true transformative change or equity for people. So at some point, we have to stop doing what we've been doing and try something new or try something different. So, you know, I think that's probably the bigger thing. And, you know, in terms of what I've learned, one thing I found being in this space is Black and brown people are often treated like a problem to solve, not people who have a meaningful contribution to larger society that they can bring. So when you listen to like the language people use, when you listen to how people talk about it, it's, we need to get them jobs so that they aren't creating problems. Like, you know, get them jobs, they're not going to commit crime. You know, if we get them jobs and they won't be unemployed, they won't, you know, need public assistance. It's not about how do we remove the inequity that's been created so that underrepresented people can reach their full potential, so that they have the ability and the opportunity to go as far as absolutely possible and not be limited by someone else, but only be limited by how far they want to go. It's never about that. But when you start talking about that, people are reluctant to get behind that. You know, people are more than happy to get behind the, if we get, you know, a bunch of Black kids jobs, then they're not going to be on the street committing crime. And people love that. But when you start talking about, hey, you know, I think we can do something more, that's not, you know, I've unfortunately found that's not something people really want to buy into. You know, I had a conversation with a potential funder one time, and you know, when I was explaining to him how we teach our kids entrepreneurship, he stopped me and said, well, why would you teach your kids those things? Isn't getting them a job good enough? So that, more common than you would think, is the thought process. And more common than you would think, people are like, I'm all in to write you a check, but how many of your kids are going to get a job in 6 months? And the minute I say that's not what we do, then people pull back, and that's not what they want to buy into. And what I've learned is, at some point, some of us have to be willing to commit to a larger vision. Some of us have to be willing to commit to something bigger, get behind it, and, you know, really double down on that. Because if none of us are willing to really get behind, buy into, and commit to that bigger vision, I fail to see how things really change. Like, you know, it's hard to make the case to me that we're going to move in a better direction ultimately if we're not willing to commit to that.
You know, this will be the perfect time for me to joke that you had the dedication of a former military guy. But the harsh reality is that this is all true. This is all too true. You know, I think that, you know, as, you know, a Black Latinx person, you know, a man in this case in America, it's always the idea of thinking like you're fixing a problem. Like, nobody calls a plumber just because they want to have somebody in their house. It's because, oh yeah, you know, hey, the toilet is messed up or whatever. But it's like, okay, well, beyond that, like, hey, why don't we be proactive? Why don't we do some different things? No, who wants to be proactive? Who actually wants to give people a better chance? We gave them jobs, we're giving them
Right.
money. It literally
Right.
isn't that enough for them? And
Yeah.
that's the sad reality, that there's too many people in these spaces of power or what have you that have that mindset. And so clearly with what you're doing, it can feel like lone wolf type of a journey sometimes, almost that of a samurai, but it's noble work and it must be done. So again, Sylvester, thank you so much for getting on this chat with me, man. And I really look forward to seeing what more comes from 1Philadelphia and your other endeavors.
I really appreciate it. Always good talking to you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
no problem. Have a great one.
You too.